Is there a God neuron? Is there a belief neuron? So through this methodology of optogenetics, can you start getting to like where a belief begins or an idea begins?
Mm-hmm.
And especially looking at the strongest of our beliefs, maybe beliefs of love and hate, but religious belief into something like really grand, on the grandest of scale.
Yeah. Neuroscience and neurology point us a little bit. We don't have an answer to that, but for
Yes,
example,
a lot of these questions I'm going to ask you, there's no good answer, but you're providing the tools that give us hope to find the answer one day.
yeah, and we have early clues. So, for example, when patients with epilepsy have experiences of religiosity as part of their seizure or the aura before their seizure, very often those are in the temporal lobe, in these parts of the brain that are at the side, and so that's an initial clue. There are also parts of the brain that are involved in the definition of the self and defining the borders or boundaries of the self. And we know this. There's just some experiments that we did in my lab. There's a part of the brain where if there's a rhythm uh, of a particular type, you can cause a separation of the sense of self from the sense of the body. What's normally bound up and unitary, we normally think of ourself and our body as pretty tightly bound up together. Those can be separated, it turns out. We can't take that for granted. And there are certain conditions, certain patterns of activity in one part of the brain called the retrosplenial cortex, where you can actually separate those two out. And so if you think about these very big questions, you know, where are the origins of religiosity? How do we define the boundaries of who we are relative to others and to the world? How do we link our self to our body, and how can that become separated? These are actually, believe it or not, now accessible and rigorously and quantitatively so. We did an experiment with optogenetics where we provided this abnormal rhythm to this particular part of the mouse brain, and we saw this separation of detection of a stimulus and caring about it.
So that's like stimulating something about the mouse brain that affects these neurons that give the conception of self.
That's right.
So you're able to dissociate the experience from the impact of the experience onto you.
That's right. Exactly right.
So like these are the goals of meditation. These are the goals whenever I get drunk, pretty much effective. I mean, that's not a scientific statement, just an experiential, anecdotal one. Also, psychedelics seek to this, to attain this kind of state. That's so interesting.
Well, you mentioned psychedelics, DMT and 5-MeO DMT. These create this religious experience, this connection. People describe them as a strong connection to God. In theory, these are accessible with modern methods. We now that we have these rich recording methods, we can explore what are the precise millisecond resolution, cellular resolution, brain-wide manifestations of these altered states.
So, like you could look at an altered state, like on DMT, record it across many people, and then from there see where do these experiences originate in the brain in terms of single neurons, and then how do they propagate and interact with everything else, and if there's some kind of common signal, like how do you narrow down the set of neurons that are responsible for a particular experience or for a particular behavioral effect?
Yeah, here's where optogenetics is so useful, because anytime you give an agent like an agent like ketamine or PCP, which we used for our dissociation experiments that I was mentioning, or you have a psychedelic, LSD or DMT for this altered perceptual state, if you give either of those, these change everything across the brain. Okay, so just the fact that you maybe give them to a mouse, let's say, or eventually to a human, you won't know yet which cells to home in on as the causal players in all this just by recording the activity. But then what we found is that optogenetics, providing a causal pattern of activity guided by what you see, can let you test hypotheses. And we saw this rhythm with ketamine and PCP for dissociation. And then we said, okay, let's test what's causal. We came in and provided that rhythm. We tried a few different things, but only one of the causal tests we tried actually caused the behavioral dissociation. And so that's how we home in on what actually matters.
And is it repeatable once you see the causality? So like that's one definition of causality is like you try it and it repeats across different mice and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
And so you could do that for DMT. You could do that for the really fascinating mind expanding. Thank you, thank you for. So the meme for people just listening. This is again another disagreement between Freud and Carl Jung. Religion and spirituality. This is I guess the ring scene from Lord of the Rings. Religion and spirituality. Freud says cast it into the fire, destroy it. Carl Jung says no. So for people who don't know, Sergei is the Slavic lord of the meme. Thank you. I appreciate that. So what we're talking about, so there is, I mean, I think a connection between DMT and religious experiences or some of these psychedelics. Do you think it's possible to sort of stimulate religious experiences? So religious experiences are one of the most deep kind of experiences. And so here you could first understand where they originate, how they propagate through the brain, and then to stimulate them.
Yeah. And so these can happen in
Fascinating.
people who had no predisposition. People who are, as agnostic or atheistic as you'd like, they can feel connected to God in these states. Now, to be clear, I'm not advocating these. We don't know what's safe in human beings, but we definitely not yet. But we definitely can do these experiments in mice, and that was already very productive in understanding dissociation. So we can already imagine making headway on these methods. And then, this does map onto the non-psychedelic human experience. I had a patient who's actually described in the book, Projections. This was the patient that's in the mania chapter, the bipolar chapter. Here was a guy who had never had a psychiatric illness or symptom in his life. He was a retirement age gentleman, and nobody in his family either. So no family history, no personal history of any psychiatric illness, and he had never been religious particularly before either. Certainly no passionate, type of religion. But he, not through any psychedelic or drug, he had a stressful experience, actually a post 9/11 change in how he was thinking, and he was pushed into a manic state, revealing that he had bipolar, never before known in this case, in this person. And his mania, his elevated state in bipolar, included this profound religiosity which he had never had before. And he was preaching in a elevated, vigorous way to his family. And so this state can be created in people who, even late in life, who had no predisposition for it, and even without a neurochemical. So there's the causality of that is very interesting to explore. How did the manic state unleash this religiosity? But you see that in other realms of psychiatry too. OCD can manifest as religiosity also. You can take people who never really had a religion, never played a powerful role in their life, but then when their obsessive compulsive symptoms become severe, they can manifest in this.
I think I'm in that group. So I'm a bit OCD. We have I think there's subreddits when there's oddly satisfying things. So there's certain things that are really satisfying to my OCD, my mild OCD. I think it's pretty much a religious experience. So I understand that if it's not direct, it's at least rhymes. Yeah. So maybe can you speak to as Sergei is probably desperately scrambling to pull up oddly satisfying. Thank you. People can check it out themselves. It is, as the subreddit promises, oddly satisfying.